Very welcome to the TV program Hotspot. And as you hear, I speak English today. This is actually the very first program we do in English, because today we have an international guest, one that is well known as India's foremost Christian intellectual. And you'll get to know this man more, but not just India, but also the Western world, because this man has a particular insight and experience to describe different contexts and situations, both externally and internally. And he's currently on a book tour in Sweden. He has written several books. One of them is called Truth and Transformation. A large one is called The Book That Made Your World, about the book that shaped the modern world. And there's also a version of the same book called This Book Changed Everything. And this book is actually today released in Swedish. So we are looking much forward to a conversation with Vishal Mangalwadi. So welcome to Sweden. This seems to be your first time in Sweden.
Thank you. I'm very grateful that you wrote the foreword to my book and
Indeed.
You are introducing me and the book to the audience.
I'm so glad to be able to do that and to spread it in Sweden. So now we're in early May. Is this a good time to come to Sweden?
It's a wonderful weather. We celebrated yesterday the start of the spring last night, and I'm very grateful that the Lord gave us this beautiful weather.
And we can see, even if we haven't heard your name, we see from your clothing that you do not come from Sweden.
No, my wife and I come from India, and right now we're coming from Norway. So we are traveling to Norway where the different book was translated, and now Sweden, and then we go to Finland where 3 of my books have been published in Finnish, and then we go to Denmark.
And currently you and your wife, you live in America, right?
Yes, we don't have a home in America, but we do have 2 daughters and 6 grandchildren, and my wife was babysitting on and off for the 2 younger grandchildren, so we love living there, but they are moving to Malaysia, so we don't know where we will be.
Okay, but very welcome to Sweden anyway. In these programs, we typically bring up present-day situations in society that are challenging and problematic, and we try to find ways of solutions. But you, having experience both from India and the Western world, if you were to begin this conversation by just summarizing, what are the main challenges that you see in the Western world today, if we just give a very brief introduction?
Sure. There are 2 different images that can communicate my conclusion. One is a series of lectures I gave at the University of Minnesota in the US. They were titled, Must the Sun Set on the West? The sun is setting. During the last 500 years, the modern world began in Europe and spread. So Europe blessed India. That was the sunrise. Now it is setting. The other image that was used by Bishop Ratzinger, who became Pope for a little while, that the Western civilization is a bouquet of beautiful flowers. These flowers have been cut off from their roots. They look beautiful in a vase, but they're drying, withering. So the West is flowers that is beautiful to look at, but cut off from the roots, which is the Bible, and therefore everything is withering. Now the West cannot even define marriage. What is male, what is female, what is marriage, what is love. And you've created a situation where the most unsafe place for a baby is his mother's womb. So you're self-destructing. The West is on its way to self-destruction. When we think of Scandinavian countries, Nordic countries, we think of them as the most civilized, free, prosperous, peaceful, corruption-free nations. But 1,000 years ago, Scandinavian nations were terrorists. Vikings.
Yeah,
They
precisely.
were terrorizing the world. How did these terrorists, what civilized them to become amongst the best nations in the world? And that was the Bible.
So that is your common theme in your books, and not least in this book that we're releasing in Swedish today, in Swedish called Boken som förändrade allt. This book changed everything. And you give a sort of description, introduction that I find interesting, that the Bible is actually an Asian book coming and civilizing Europe. I think that's an interesting picture.
That's correct. So that is the heart of my thesis. I began exploring this because in 1980, in India, I was serving victims of a hailstorm. A hailstorm had flattened wheat crop in 100 villages, shattered the roofs of people. I was organizing relief, and the district magistrate banned our relief work. So we said, okay, we won't offer relief, but we will pray. Maybe the government itself will offer relief. But they banned our prayer meeting, which was a non-sectarian public prayer meeting. And the superintendent of police told me that if you have that prayer meeting, I will personally kill you. I will not arrest you. I will not produce you before a magistrate. I'll take you from your home into the jungle, shoot you, throw your body. Hyenas will eat you. You cancel that prayer meeting. We prayed about it. We decided not to cancel the prayer meeting. But they didn't kill me because the press was supporting me. So they threw me in jail. That's where I began to think about the fact, when I come out of the jail, will the police kill me? Here is a highly educated police officer who has taken an oath to uphold the Constitution of India, which assures me of my fundamental right to life.
Precisely, because you were a secular country in a good fashion.
And the constitutions give me the right to life. But he has no respect for the Constitution or my right to life. He is telling me to my face, he understood that I wasn't believing him, so he gave me lots of anecdotes of how many people he had killed, innocent people. How do you create a nation where there is right to life, right to property, right to family, where there is justice, where there is freedom to meet together and pray? So I began studying India, how was modern India created, which he's rejecting. And this was the first book. And since then, it's called the father of modern India, William Carey, how modern India was created. Then I went on to continue studying Indian history. And how was this modern India, which our present government is rejecting? How was this India created? And I realized that modern India was created by the Bible.
This is particularly interesting for me, who work for an organization called the Clapham Institute, who take our inspiration from William Wilberforce. And I get the impression that you think William Wilberforce to be inspirational for the creation of modern India too.
He was very important. He never came to India, but as a member of parliament, he helped abolish the widow burning. Because he prayed, he would get reports of the widows that were being burnt alive on their husband's funeral pyre, and he would pray at his dining table for this evil. But he also supported training of civil servants and translation of the Bible in different Indian languages, but particularly for 20 years, from 1793 to 1813, he fought a 20-year-long political battle for freedom and civility in India, that the British East India Company must permit missionaries to come and educate India so that Indians can learn to govern themselves with freedom and civility. So that was Wilberforce's long battle, just as he was fighting for Africa to end slave trade. and then eventually to end slavery, he also fought that East India Company, which is coming to India to make money, and then it is ruling, fine, you are a businessman, you want to go to India to make money, that's fine. But then you should also allow missionaries to go there and serve India and prepare Indians to govern themselves. So that was Wilberforce's Clapham group's contribution to modernization of India. What else has this book done besides creating modern India? And that's when these books began to be conceptualized, that actually the Bible created modern West. This was saying how the Vikings were transformed into the most civilized people. This was the great achievement of the Bible. Now you're rejecting the very ideas, beliefs, truth is power, and you're rejecting that truth, and therefore you're self-destructing your own civilization.
Precisely. I think you wrote a very interesting quote about the truth, saying that a postmodern myth is that those who believe in truth are, by definition, intolerant, and that myth makes people blind. They can't see that the political correctness is destroying the West's hard-won freedom.
Yes.
Could you expand on this?
Sure. The West was very intolerant. The cross was Roman Empire. So it was actually invented by the Greeks, but the Roman Empire terrorized the world. But anyone who is criticizing the empire, who is perceived to be a threat to empire, can be crucified.
Now we're back at the very beginning of the shaping of Europe, right?
Sure. So Tom Holland, a historian in Britain, he's written a very powerful section on what the cross was. You have the cross on your flag.
Yeah, precisely.
So a instrument of terror, the cross, was taken by Jesus and transformed into an instrument of love and compassion and justice and mercy and the force for tolerance. So right up to the Middle Ages, so when the modern world begins with the Reformation, you have a situation where William Tyndale translates the New Testament into English.
And this is an interesting character. If we just say something about him, me and my family, we were in London last spring, and we were walking past the Parliament buildings and those courtiers, and I saw a huge statue, and I went up to take a photo of him, and it was William Tyndale, who is quite unknown in Sweden, but you seem to give him a very central part in shaping the cultural movement in the West.
You and I are talking in English, it's because of Tyndale. At that time, learning was in Latin. He translated the New Testament into English. It had been done 130 years ago by Wycliffe, but at that time, printing didn't exist in Europe. So Wycliffe Bible was never printed, and his English is medieval English, which influenced Chaucer, the poet. But Tyndale's English is what influenced Bunyan and Milton and Shakespeare and King James Bible. 90% of the King James Bible is from William Tyndale. But he had to print the New Testament in Belgium and smuggle into England, because England would not allow the New Testament in English to be read by the people. So he was strangled and burnt at stake, William Tyndale. This is how brutal Europe was at the end of the 500 years ago. But how was Europe civilized that today you can publish pornography and be honored for it? And you can do anything. So the Bible was the force, and particularly Martin Luther.
Yeah, you give an interesting comparison there. At almost the same time, Machiavelli wrote his book, The Prince, and Martin Luther wrote his material. And that sort of showed two different ways of shaping Europe, right?
Yes. Machiavelli and Luther were contemporary. Machiavelli was a diplomat who had traveled around in many states as an Italian diplomat. His book, The Prince, begins the study. The main question the prince is asking, how does a prince acquire power, and how does he sustain power? Because once he becomes king, or the nobleman, many people want to poison him, kill him, assassinate him. This was the tradition all over the world. How do you acquire power? How do you retain power? So Machiavelli sees politics as pursuit of power. Luther wrote a book in 1520. Machiavelli's book was not published until 1532.
Okay.
So a draft may have been written earlier, but it was published 12 years after Luther's book, A Treatise on Christian Liberty. So it was Martin Luther's book, A Treatise on Christian Liberty. He wrote 3 books in 1520. This was the 3rd book. And it was that book which changed politics as pursuit of freedom. Now, Luther's idea of pursuit of freedom were developed better by Calvin, particularly by Huguenots in France, and the Scottish Reformation, who really created the first democratic nation, modern democratic nation, Scotland. But the seed began with Luther's study of Galatians, because Galatians is Paul's letter about freedom.
Right.
Galatians 5:1 says that for freedom Christ has set you free. Do not allow anyone to enslave you again. So when the gospel has come to the Christians in Galatians, Jesus has set them free, because that is in fact the heart of the Bible. The book of Bible began to be written after a bunch of slaves, the Hebrews, came out of slavery of Egypt.
Yes.
Because God wanted them to be a great nation. They had to be a free people, governing themselves on their own farms, each man under his own vine, his own fig tree, with the freedom to invite his neighbors for a party in his vineyard, with no one making them afraid.
So then the Puritans and the other immigrants took that message with them when they built the new nation in America.
It was very important for General George Washington. He didn't want to be a king. He chose to be a president. And he was only one-term president for 5 years or 4 years. And in that one term, he used that motive of each man under his own vine, his own fig tree, 48 times in his official prayers, in his official pronouncements, that the goal. So in Russia, the agriculture farmers were collectivized.
Yes.
It was taken over. In America, private property, private ownership, freedom, economic freedom, political freedom, this was very important.
And we can compare the different cultures in the world. Here you make interesting comparisons between, the free West and the Hindu-dominated India and the Muslim world. You actually have one chapter heading which is quite provocative in our time, saying, what made the West the best? And it's very difficult to say that in the West, but perhaps you can say it because you're Indian.
Yes, correct. Very few Westerners would love to go and settle down in India, take Indian citizenship, but millions of Indians would love to come to the West.
But your point is that the West became the best because of the Christian foundation.
Exactly.
So?
Exactly. I'm saying, and which is a rude thing to say, that the Scandinavians were terrorists. Before there was Islamic terrorism, there was Scandinavia. Well, no, Muhammad was few 100 years before the Vikings, but nevertheless, the Vikings were terrorists, but they were civilized by the Bible, and that began to change and created. But the roots, the ideas, the beliefs, the values that transformed So Jesus said that the gospel was like leaven. You put it in a bunch of flour and transforms everything.
And you give the impression, you give several really interesting examples in your book about the differences that the biblical foundation had to innovations, to literature, to culture, to economy, almost all over the field. That's quite large conclusions.
We could take an example of freedom, we can take an example of human dignity, but with regard to freedom, although application of the Bible to politics begins with Luther's book, which began to be secularized in France 70 years after Luther by Jean Bodin. He was a Roman Catholic philosopher, thinker in France, who began to secularize Luther's idea of politics as pursuit of freedom. But Luther himself understood his case for freedom from two important thinkers. The first was an Oxford professor, William of Ockham, who read Genesis 1:1, in the beginning God created heavens and the earth. God existed before the cosmos. He exists outside the cosmos. He's free from the laws and logic that govern. The cosmos can be deterministic, but God is not determined. He's free. He can do what he wants to do. That was William of Ockham, 13th century. Pico della Mirandolo, an young Italian thinker, he applied during the Renaissance the idea of the freedom of God to man. What is man? He didn't know about amoebas and bacteria, but from earthworms all the way to archangels, there are a whole series of creatures. Where does man fit? He says man doesn't fit anywhere, because he can become dumb as an animal, but he can also become greater and more powerful than the mightiest angels, because man alone is made in God's image. So the freedom, and he wrote a book, an oration on the dignity of man. So the idea of the freedom of God gave birth to the idea of freedom of man, that human beings can change their destiny.
Okay.
That was the idea of the dignity of man.
And you mean that's part of the route to innovation power?
Absolutely.
That did not exist, for instance, in China, in India, in the Muslim world?
Exactly. That there was fatalism all over the world. So it was, in India, was culture of astrology, and it was replaced by culture of astronomy. In astrology, your times rule over you. Sun, moon, stars, planets, they rule over you. But in culture of astronomy, you study the science, heavenly science of constellations, sun, moon, stars, in order to establish your dominion on the earth. So this transformation of Europe was also a culture of astrology, but the Bible taught, yes, sun and moon were created to govern the day and the night. They have authority. They decide, the sun decides when we wake up, when we go to bed, what we wear, whether we wear overcoat.
But you're free to act and build within.
Yes, but you can say to the sun, look, you can affect the birds and the trees, but what the temperature will be in my house, my studio, my tractor, my factory, I decide. So I'm establishing my own dominion, and I can use the power of the sun, gather it during the day in batteries, and then run my light. So whether my room will have light at night, the sun can create darkness all over the world, but in my light, I'm using the power of the sun to light up my room because I want to read or I want to write or whatever.
Yeah.
So this concept of human freedom, which the virtue of the fact that human beings are not like rest of the creature, but we are unique because we bear the image of a God who is free. Luther applies that to politics, that, okay, if God has given freedom to man, then state cannot take it away. State exists to guarantee your right to freedom, inalienable right to freedom. This is what led to my first conflict with the state in India, that the Constitution gives me the right to pray, to call other people to pray, that we have suffered because of this hailstorm. We are asking God to give us relief. And the state says, no, you're not allowed to pray. So have I become a slave in Hindu India? Or has God given me the freedom? So do I have the right to defy? So the magistrate, subdivisional magistrate, actually asked me that if you sign this bond, that you will not have that prayer meeting, I will let you go. I said, no, I would rather go to jail, because in jail I'm free to pray.
Right, because you thought you had the right to stand on the right.
And that the Hindu leadership of India is robbing the freedom that God gave to us in India because of His word, because of the missionary education. And many of the Swedish missionaries were educating, running schools in India. It began with the British missionaries. So once we have understood truth, including that the government exists to protect my freedom, not to rob me of my freedom. If government is going wrong, I have the right to protest. That is what Protestant movement was, that we have the right to protest, that look, God's will must be done through the rulers, through the parents. Rulers have authority, parents have authority.
But they don't have final authority. They have an authority above them.
They have the authority to make sure that God's will is being done.
And I get the impression that you suggest that as there is a final authority above man, Christian rulers cannot or should not take complete totalitarianism
that
into their
was
hands.
The essential point of the Old Testament, that David takes his neighbor's wife, commits adultery, and when she's pregnant, he organizes murder, death of her husband. And Nathan the prophet comes and says that, look, you may be the king, but you have no right to covet your neighbor's wife, to get your neighbor killed. This is what happened with Ahab and Jezebel, who is taking property, vineyard of Naboth, and she asks the elders of Naboth's village to bring false accusers, drag him out, stone him to death, so that she can take his Naboth's vineyard and give it to her husband. That this is the way you govern nations, your nation. And Elijah comes along and he says that, no, you may be the king, but this is not, she was from Sidon, and this is not your father's heathen kingdom. This is where God's word rules. God has said, you shall not bear false witnesses, you shall not kill, you shall not covet, you shall not steal. You've broken all of those commandments. So freedom comes from obeying God's law, and the state's job is to make sure that God's will is being done, and the people who are breaking God's law, they are punished. Now, you might need to apply God's law to different areas of life and define it and apply it, but you don't have the authority to violate God's law.
Right.
So that's where the idea that the universe has a supreme authority, a sovereign God. God is sovereign, He's on the throne, He has the ultimate power and authority. This is very important for a number of reasons. One of them is optimism in the West. If there is a conflict of good and evil, will good overcome evil?
And you see a difference here between pantheistic Hinduism and other worldviews.
Not just pantheistic Hinduism, but also Greek mythology. If you look at Greek plays, they are called tragedies, or you look at Greek epics, there is no confidence that good will triumph over evil. A man may be very good, he may be very heroic, but the gods are very vicious and mean. And they will create obstacles and they will make sure that in the end, the good man loses. How do I know that being good and being committed to goodness, even if it means being burnt at stake, that optimism that in the end righteousness and justice will be upheld, because there is a final judgment, there is a final judge, a supreme God who is good. So the confidence that good will triumph over evil. So George Lucas, who creates the Star Wars saga,
Right.
he wrestles with it. Are good and evil two sides of the same force, the dark side and the light side? If they are two sides of the same coin, on what grounds do we believe that good will overcome evil? So when he created the first 6 episodes, the viewers thought he's talking about yin-yang. There's the Jedi, there's Sith, there's light side of the force, there's dark side. Will the good side win? Before the 7, 8, 9 episodes were built, he wrote the stories, published them on the internet. They were changed later, but his fan club got very upset that how can you have evil destroyed in the end? And he said, he wrote in his defense that if the good does not overcome evil, there is no story. There is no reason for heroism. You might as well join the dark side because now power matters. Goodness and truth don't matter. So he, of course, he was born and grew up as a Methodist, and his Christian worldview finally overcame his postmodern pantheistic worldview. So much of the film is pantheistic, that the Jedi meditate, practice yoga, and the Sith practice yoga. Both acquire power. Their laser swords are crystal power, the material power. But is there a sovereign God who is good? This was both the foundation for Western optimism and the belief that good will overcome evil.
Here's an interesting, well, there are several interesting comparisons you do with different cultures. One I think about is that in Sweden, we'd like to think that all cultures are the same, but you show a very practical example of showing how, you know, you've mentioned the American view that all men are created equal, and that's a truth we hold to be self-evident. But you give one example in your book about an example from India about a little girl called Sheila, which showed that there is a difference on how you view the human being. Could you tell us that story?
Yes. When Ruth and I got married, we decided to go and serve the poor. We didn't know what that means, how to serve the poor. So at that time, I was writing my first book. It's called The World of Gurus, which once it was published in 77, an instant bestseller, and became a book that is used in many universities. It's because of that, actually, I was invited to our house because it's a study of Hindu gurus, and that's why I'm called an Indian philosopher, because I wrote a book which is a book on Hindu philosophy, which is taught at the university level. Right. But as I was, we didn't have any table and chair, let alone a computer. I was handwriting. My wife would type it and edit it because her English was better. When I didn't have enough work for her, she would pick up the bicycle and go into the village, and she was going door to door, surveying how many children are there in this home, how many of them are studying, who is not studying, why are they not studying. And she asked a girl, how many brothers and sisters do you have? And this 10-year-old girl said that, well, I have 3, maybe 4. So do you have 3 or do you have 4? Well, 4th is almost dead, so 3. almost dead. Is she still alive? Can I come and see her? So this girl took Ruth to see this Sheila, 18-month-old baby, um, on a cot with no sheets, no mattress, string cot. Her thighs were as thick as my thumb. She's 18 months, fully covered with flies because pus was oozing out of her body, and she had no strength to wipe away, chase the flies away.
And your wife suggested that she could help her.
My wife said that yes. She asked, what's wrong with her? The mother said, oh, she doesn't eat anything. She vomits everything we give her, so she's dying. So, have you taken her to the hospital? Hospital? How can we take her to the hospital? We have no money. But the government hospital is free. Yeah, but where is the time? I can't go to the city because I'm afraid of the city. Well, take your husband. No, how can he leave his farm and take this girl? So Ruth couldn't understand, because this was the first experience for us. You're so poor that your daughter is dying, treatment is free, you can't take her to the hospital. So Ruth said, okay, I'll give you the money, I'll come with you. She said, I'll talk to my husband. So Ruth came back, told me to go and talk to the husband. When I went back, they had decided they're not going to the hospital. Why not? We don't have the money. But my wife told you.
Yes, excuses.
So the struggle when we did force them to take the daughter to the hospital, keep her in 3 weeks in the hospital, and then the bill was going too high. She was in a Christian hospital, so we had to bring her to our home. She stayed in our home for several weeks. The mother came and fought, took the daughter back home. And we were happy to give the daughter the clothes and money for the milk, etc. But in a few weeks, she was back to square one, because the milk, which was meant for her, was being given to the boys. So the whole process was repeated. And she went to the hospital for a few weeks, came to our home for a few weeks. The mother came back, fought, took the daughter. Before we knew it, in 2 or 3 days, the daughter was dead.
And it's an incredibly sad story, but you draw conclusions on this based on worldview and human dignity.
Yes. Well, for them, the second girl was a liability. One girl was enough to cook and look after the boys and clean the house. They didn't need second girl. They have to look after her for 10, 15 years and then marry her. It means dowry. The husband's family will torture the girl to extract more money from the parents. And she will come home, her mother's home, for delivery. That's more cost, more expense. So second girl is a liability. Life is misery. This is what Buddha said. Life is suffering. The only way to get rid of suffering is to get rid of life. End life. This was Buddha's nirvana. Could this girl actually become a blessing to her family, blessing to her village? Can she transform the economy of the village, the economy of the city, the state, the country? Yes, if we invest in her, develop her abilities, develop her potential. So this was a conflict of two cultures.
Yes.
Where we did not understand that infanticide was a common practice in our villages until we saw 3 other kids being killed by their own parents. So we, Ruth actually decided to start a Sheila's Children's Garden. Right. Her name was Sheila, so that was Sheila Balvatika, where we will begin to equip these kids to study. And we didn't want to compete with the government schools, so we did after this, when the government teachers had gone to the city, Then we gather the kids together and give them non-formal education.
Yeah. Because you were building on another worldview and another view of the human
That
being,
each
right?
child is precious. Each child, if given an opportunity, can become creative, productive, a blessing to the whole world. So the children are not liability. They can be assets, and they should be assets. They are precious because Jesus gave his life for them. God wants to give them abundant life. And death is not God's plan. This is a curse upon human sin. So, yes, so that project grew, and this is what many people began to be attracted to, both what we were doing and our worldview, which was affirming the dignity and value of every individual, the littlest child, but also grown-up people who were born in lower castes, who were treated as untouchables. And
we are now in May, when we record this program, we are in the middle of an election in India, and we don't know much about Indian politics in Sweden, even though it's the world's largest democracy. But there is a party called the BJP who has governed India. What have the challenges been for religious freedom for Christians and Muslims, if you were to summarize that briefly?
In many of the states where both the central government was the BJP Hindu government and the state government was also BJP government, so they called it double engine train. So the state and the national engines are both governed in Hindu hands. There, the church has seen a lot of persecution. There were states where there was very little persecution, because the opposition parties were ruling in the state and they controlled the police. But I was actually the first person in my state, in Madhya Pradesh, who was imprisoned twice for allegedly converting Hindus by force.
Right. But there seems to be a Hindu nationalism that is growing in India.
It has been growing. It has been ruling the national government for the last 2 decades, last 10 years, 2 elections. We have a 5-year term. But right now, as you said, election is going on, the results will come on the 4th of June. It appears that the militant Hindu party will lose unless they cheat.
Or if they build a coalition, I get that impression at least.
It's possible that they have plenty of money to buy some candidates who have won on opposition platform. They could be bought, and then a coalition could be created. But the chances at this moment appear that the national mood, particularly the lower castes, want to be delivered, because this has become one of the most corrupt governments in the history of India, where the institutions of the police, the intelligence, the income tax, enforcement directorate, etc., and some of the provisions of the constitutions have been abused to punish political opponents and economically successful industries, to punish them, harass them, extract large amounts of donations and political, it's called bonds, that you purchase bonds for a political party. And so everybody can see that this Hindu party has benefited a few multi-billionaires, but it has created massive unemployment and inflation for the ordinary people.
I thought we could conclude this discussion by looking upon the West as it is today. You have sort of described the foundation and the tradition that the Christian worldview has built the West, but still the West seems to be crumbling and losing a lot of its foundations. How would you describe what is happening to the West? You will see it from an outsider's perspective.
It's very simple, actually. Greek rationalism, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle particularly, has been studied for the last 700-800 years. An average person thinks that rationalism ruled Greece, which it didn't. Greek culture and Roman culture were built on myth, magic, mysticism, occult. Alexander was discipled by Aristotle. Alexander traveled to India with philosophers. One of them was Pyrrho of Elea. Alexander returned. Pyrrho stayed there for 18 months, studied Buddhism. He was already skeptical that human reason can know truth. Buddhism destroyed his faith in reason. So rationalism was destroyed by Buddhism 325 years before Christ with this Greek philosopher. Pyrrho returned and he ended Greek rationalism.
Okay, I think we need to cut a little bit, because I'd like to use something like the last 10 minutes or so to talk about the West and the current situation. So I'll just go back to the question. If we try to conclude this discussion by the West, you have described the building up of the West on a biblical foundation, but now the West seems to be crumbling and the foundation seems to be shaking. What is happening and why is it happening in the West now?
What is happening is that the force that built the West, which was the Bible, was rejected in favor of human reason, which had already been destroyed in the West. Western monasteries, the Irish monasteries, began to restore faith in human reason based on the Bible. Sure. The Bible said that human mind is made in God's image. Therefore, you must study and cultivate your mind. So, human mind during the Middle Ages, Christian monasteries, particularly in Western Europe, Latin-speaking Europe, Christian monasteries, where a young man is going into a monastery, he's going to learn to pray, to fast, to sing. But he's studying philosophy, logic, language, literature. So the mind was being cultivated in monasteries, out of which came universities. But with René Descartes, who was a Roman Catholic philosopher, mathematician, he thought that we don't need revelation, we don't need the Bible. Human mind is sufficient. So rationalism came back, which had already been discredited in Greece. Rationalism began to grow, and many Protestant philosophers foolishly accepted that the human reason was sufficient. We don't need God's revelation to know the truth. They destroyed the Protestant denominations, and soon, by the time of Immanuel Kant in 1781, he wrote his Critique of Pure Reason. 1788, he wrote the Critique of Practical Reason.
So you mean that the downfall of the West has long-term roots in tearing down the foundation?
Beginning from Descartes to Nietzsche, it became clear that you reject God's revelation, you want to believe your own mind, but you don't even know what mind is. You don't know what is language. You don't know what is logic.
So you believe that the woke movement that we see now is not a 21st century product, it is the product of a long-term deterioration?
Sure. You have, by the 19th century, 1900, when Nietzsche died, his statement, God is dead, meant truth is dead, reason is dead, intellect is dead, mind is dead, will matters. With Marx, economics matter, money matters. With Freud, sex matters, instincts matter. So the mind was already killed, except with Christian philosophers and theologians, which we call liberal theology. They continued to believe in mind when the secular Europe had already destroyed all the foundations for believing in human reason alone. Human reason is valid, human language is valid, only if human mind is actually made in God's image if God speaks, what is language? What is words? The secular world has no understanding. That's why you have whole anti-philosophical movements like existentialism or linguistic analysis or deconstructionism, etc., have developed. So the West has destroyed itself by cutting off its roots, which is the Bible, God's revelation, trusting in ourselves. But now, women don't want to marry men because they can't trust the men who love them. Because every woman knows that she is marrying a sinner. Either you be delivered from the sinner or you seek salvation from sin. But the feminists are not willing to say that sin is the problem and we seek humbly salvation from sin. We need a savior. So you are destroying your family, you're destroying your children, and you will become slaves in Europe by others who are willing to have children.
But then socialists would say we create a new heaven on earth by creating the classless society and so on. The liberals say that we create another kind of paradise on earth. But you would say, I get the impression that you say that this won't work in the long term.
You have turned your own homes into hell. That's why you want divorce. You cannot live with your own spouses. How are you going to create new heaven, a heaven on earth? So you are deceiving nobody but yourself.
You ask a rhetorical question in the end, which is of course, the million-dollar question here. Can the West be renewed? And the answer to the rhetorical question, how do you put it?
Yes, the sun can rise again because you have the truth. What you need is humility to return to God's word and say that, yes, beginning with René Descartes up to Nietzsche, we tried to know the truth with our own minds alone, our own philosophy. We failed. Now we need help. We don't know who we are. This was John Calvin's Institutes of Christian Religion. His first chapter is called The Knowledge of Man and of God is Connected. If we are made in God's image, then we cannot know who we are unless we have first looked upon the face of God, he says. If we refuse to seek the knowledge of God, then we have to look at monkeys to understand who we are. Our dogs, as Pavlov would do in Russia, we have to look at animals. So either you reduce human beings to animals, or you seek to make man into God's image, which is how he was created originally, that God made man in his own image. We've lost the image of God, but the Savior came to restore God's image in us.
And that would have societal implications as well if Western society were to pick up that thread again. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, to begin very simply, to acknowledge that, yes, I'm a sinner and my wife is a sinner. The only basis we can live together is if we accept his forgiveness for my sin and accept my sinful spouse and seek her or his salvation as for the image of God to be reformed in us. When our children rebel against us, we become like the father of the prodigal son in not rejecting our children, but praying for them, restoring God's image in them. So repentance, faith, renewal, and this will have implication everywhere. I mean, the simple idea, why is Sweden a nation? Norway, Finland were Swedish colonies. Should Sweden recolonize them? Or should Sweden respect the national borders? Should Russia colonize Ukraine, a part of Ukraine? Or are the national borders of Ukraine sacred? So this idea that empire, imperialism is diabolical. It is coveting your neighbor's property. You love your own land, you develop your own land, you build your own land, you fight for your land, you die for your land, but don't covet your neighbor's land. This idea came into Europe from the Bible. And in fact, it was born here in Sweden during the 30-year war when Protestants and Catholics were killing each other. John Amos Comenius was here in Sweden, and he was trying to get the emperor's help for freedom of his Bohemia, his people. So it was in the Peace of Westphalia in 1648 where Holland first became the first sovereign nation in Europe. The mayor of Basel was sent to the Peace of Westphalia, which is northwestern Germany, that Swiss Confederacy should be recognized as a sovereign nation. Those were the two sovereign nations. As a result, USA became the third sovereign nation. This was the Bible's impact. Nation is a Jewish idea, because of which colonialism became dirty word. Imperialism became dirty word. And Sweden decided not to be an empire, but to be a nation, respecting the other nations in the neighborhood. So the Bible has created the very concept of nation and peace, that you are not taking over Norway, but you're living in peace with Norway.
We hope for that. And we're also very glad that you are one of the few foreign persons who can separate between Sweden and Switzerland. And we thank you very much for coming to Sweden.
Thank you
very much for coming to the Hotspot studio, and wish you all the best for your continued journey. Thank you, Vishal.
Well, thank you, and thank you for writing the foreword to my book and for promoting it, making your audience aware.
And to you who have watched this program, next time you will hear a different guest and you will hear it in Swedish. But I hope that this program has been insightful and hopefully interesting to listen to, and wishing you all the best for your continued week, and hope to see you again next week.